Adeline Vance was 19 the morning her own father read her name off the courthouse steps like a warrant. They turned her saddlebag out in the yard in front of the hands. $60 in gold spilled into the dust, out of a pouch she never packed. She didn't argue. She didn't cry. She saddled the dun mare herself. The foreman held up a letter she never wrote. Her aunt spoke for the 40-odd neighbors gathered for the autumn branding. We always knew what she was. And her father, shamed before the whole county, said the words that cut deepest of all. No daughter of mine steals. So, you're no daughter of mine. She rode out with $11 and a horse. 11 years later, the crier's hammer came down on the Vance Ranch, and the whole county turned to see who'd bought it. If anyone ever told you you'd be nothing without them, this story is for you. Before we go on, if you believe a name can be cleared and a wrong made right, subscribe and ride the rest of this out with me. And comment the town you're watching from. I want to see how far this ride carries. Now, let's go back to the beginning. Coldwater Fork sat in the Sweetwater country of Wyoming Territory, and in the autumn of 1871, it was a small place trying to be a town. A church with a bell that had come in on a freight wagon. A store. A courthouse of squared logs that smelled of pine pitch on hot days. Around it, the ranches spread out along the creek bottoms, and the biggest of them was the Lazy V. Josiah Vance had built it. He'd come up from Texas with a trail crew when he was a young man, and he'd stayed when the others turned back. He'd married a quiet woman named Ruth, and Ruth had given him one child, a girl, before the fever took her in a hard march. So Josiah raised the girl himself, on horseback and at the ledger table, and the men on the place called her Della because her father did. By 19, she could read a herd better than any hand who drew wages there. She could tell a bloated heifer from a bred one at 50 yards. She knew which cows would drop early and which would drift in a north wind. And she kept the books. She had kept them since she was 14, since the winter her father's eyes started to fail him by lamplight, and he pushed the ledger across the table and said, "You do it, Della girl. Your hand's steadier than mine anyhow." That was the thing about her that no one talked about much, because it didn't fit a girl. She had a head for figures. Columns lined up under her pen like fence posts. She could look at a page of a man's accounts and find the dollar that didn't belong the way you'd find a burr in a saddle blanket. It was quiet work, and it was hers, and she loved it the way she loved the land. She loved the land most of all. There's a morning she carried with her the rest of her life, and it was an ordinary one. She couldn't have been more than 8. Her father lifted her up onto the corral rail and let her sit there while the men worked the spring calves. He had the iron in the fire, the Lazy V iron, and when it came out glowing, he pressed it to the rail so she could see the shape of it burn brown into the wood. "You see that, Della girl?" he said. "That marks yours someday." She reached out and touched the wood where it still smoked, and it was warm under her small hand, and she believed him the way a child believes the sun will come up. "That marks yours someday." She held on to that for a long time. Longer than she should have. Now, in the fall of 71, the man who ran the Lazy V's crew was named Silas Crenshaw. He'd come on as foreman 2 years before, and he'd made himself useful fast. He was good with the hands, good with a rope, easy in the saddle. He talked to Josiah like a son talks to a father, low and respectful, and Josiah was getting old, and his eyes were bad, and he'd started to lean on Silas the way a tired man leans on a fence. Della didn't lean on him. She watched him. She couldn't have told you why at first. He never gave her cause. He touched his hat when he passed her and called her Miss Della and did his work. But there was a way he looked at the ranch when he thought no one saw. Like a man looking at a thing he means to have. She'd catch it, and it would be gone, and she'd tell herself she'd imagined it. She hadn't imagined it. There was one hand who'd been on the place longer than any of them. Ezra Bell, an old wrangler, gray in the beard, gentle with green horses. He'd been there since before Della was born, and he'd carried her on his shoulders when she was little. She trusted Ezra the way you trust weather you've known all your life. So it stayed with her. That morning, near the end of October, when she came out to the strongbox shed and found Ezra standing near it, and he wouldn't look at her. She said, "Morning, Ezra," and he said, "Miss Della," to the ground, and he moved off toward the barn quicker than an old man moves for no reason. She stood there a moment. The shed door was shut. The lock hung on its hasp the way it always did. Nothing was wrong that she could see, but Ezra Bell had never once failed to meet her eyes in 19 years, and now he had, and it sat in her chest like a swallowed stone all that day. She didn't know yet what he'd seen. She would learn it, but not for 11 years. What Ezra had seen was Silas Crenshaw, in the gray before dawn, easing the strongbox open with Josiah's own key that he'd borrowed to fetch out the branding money. Ezra had come around the corner of the shed for a coil of rope, and he'd seen Silas lift $60 in gold out of the box and slip it into a pouch and put the pouch in his coat. And Silas had seen Ezra see him. He didn't threaten the old man. He didn't have to. He just looked at him, long, and said, "You didn't see nothing, Ezra. And a man your age don't want to be looking for work in the winter." And Ezra Bell, who was 63 and had bad hips and no place else in the world, said nothing. He carried that nothing like a sickness for a very long time. 2 days later, Josiah went to the strongbox to count out the money for the fall accounts, and $60 in gold was gone. He didn't shout. He was a careful man. He counted it 3 times. He checked the box for a hole and the floor for a coin rolled loose, and there was nothing. And Silas Crenshaw, standing at his shoulder, was careful too. He didn't accuse anyone. He just frowned and said it was a bad business, and let the frown do its work, and let the quiet settle where quiet settles. "Who's had the key?" Josiah said. "Just you. Far as I know," Silas said. "You, and Miss Della does the books." He said it plain. He didn't lean on it. He didn't need to. He let it lie there on the table between them, the way you'd set down a card and not turn it over. Josiah said nothing. But something moved behind his old eyes, and Silas saw it move, and he was patient. He'd been patient 2 years. He could be patient a week more. The week gave him what he wanted, because a week later, Silas came to the house with a letter. He'd found it, he said, tucked in the tack room where Della kept a little writing desk for the accounts. He was sorry to bring it. He held it like it hurt him to hold. Verna took it first and read it, and her hand went to her mouth. Verna Toole was Josiah's sister, widowed, and come out from Ohio years back to keep the house after Ruth died. She was a woman who cared about standing more than most things, who sat near the front at church and knew everyone's business and called it Christian concern. She had never warmed to Della. A girl who did figures and read cattle and wore a man's coat in winter was not the niece Verna would have made. And now here was a letter. And the letter was terrible. It was written in a hand like Della's. A close hand. Slanted the way she slanted. Looped where she looped. And it said things. It said the writer was through with this dead-end place and her stingy old father. It said she was going off with a gambler named Emmett Doyle, a man who'd come through Coldwater Fork that summer dealing faro at the saloon. It said she'd take what was owed her before she went, and let the old man count his gold then and see what it got him. "That's her hand," Verna said. "Josiah, that's her hand." Josiah read it. He read it twice. And 2 of the hands were there in the yard. Silas had seen to that, and they read it over his shoulder. And by nightfall it was on the range that Josiah Vance's daughter was a thief, and worse, that she'd taken up with a gambler and meant to rob her own father blind. Then Silas went and turned out her saddlebag. He did it in the yard, in front of witnesses, which was the whole point of it. He said, mild as milk, that there was a simple way to settle it, and he lifted her saddlebag off its peg and shook it out onto the ground. And $60 in gold spilled out into the dust, out of a little leather pouch, and lay there shining in the cold sun for everyone to see. Della was there. She looked at the gold on the ground, and then she looked at Silas Crenshaw, and for one moment she understood the whole of it, top to bottom, the way she'd understand a crooked column of figures. She saw it plain. And she saw, just as plain, that no one else could see it, that the more she said it, the guiltier she'd sound. "I never wrote that letter," she said. Her voice was steady. "I never took that money. Someone put it there." "Whose bag is it?" Silas said gently. "Mine. You know it's mine. And whose hand's on that letter?" She had no answer to that a jury would have believed, and there was no jury, only her father's face going hard as a winter road. What she didn't know, what none of them knew, was a small thing that had happened at Wingate's store the week before. Silas Crenshaw had bought 2 sheets of fine letter paper, the good cream stock that came in from the East, the kind nobody in that country ever bought because there was no one to write to. Wingate had thought it odd. And because Wingate was a careful storekeeper who marked down every sale, he'd written it in his day ledger. 2 sheets, fine paper, S. Crenshaw. It sat in that ledger forgotten for 11 years. A small thing. It would matter more than anyone alive could have guessed. But that was later. In the fall of '71, there was only the gold in the dust and the letter in Verna's hand, and the whole county starting to nod its head. They waited for the branding to say it out loud. The autumn branding was the biggest gathering of the year in that country. Neighbors came from 30 miles to trade work, to sort the mixed cattle off the open range, to eat at long tables and swap news through a hard winter's worth of talk. 40 of them, near enough, gathered at the Lazy V that year. Men Della had known all her life. Women who'd stood at her mother's grave, children she'd taught to ride. They all knew the story by then. Silas had seen to that too. The fires were lit, and the irons were heating, and the calves were bawling in the pens, and Josiah Vance stood up on the loading chute where everyone could see him, and he did the thing that broke her. Verna started it. Verna, in her good bonnet, loud enough for the 40 to hear. We always knew what she was. And it went through the crowd like a wind through grass. A murmur. A settling. Heads turning toward the girl by the corral. Josiah lifted his hand, and they went quiet. He was gray-faced. His pride was a live thing, and it was bleeding in front of every man whose respect he'd spent 30 years earning. And when a proud man is shamed before the people whose good opinion is all he has, he will do near anything to stop the bleeding. He looked for the cause of his shame, and pride pointed him at his own child instead of at the truth, because the truth would have cost him more. "No daughter of mine steals," he said. His voice carried. It didn't shake. That was the worst of it, that it didn't shake. "So you're no daughter of mine. Get off my land." 40 faces. Not one spoke for her. She stood very still. Inside her, something was tearing loose that would never grow back the same. But she'd be damned before she'd let them watch it. She'd learned that much from him, the man casting her out. You don't beg. You don't weep in front of people who've already decided. She walked to the barn to get her saddle. She had to pass the corral to do it, and the Lazy V iron was there, heating in the fire, the mark her father had told her was hers someday. She reached for it without thinking, the way you reach for a thing that's yours. "Don't touch it," Silas said. He was at the gate. He said it low, just for her, and his eyes were bright with a thing he was careful to keep off his face. "That's not yours." Never was. She drew her hand back. She saddled the dun mare Juniper and cinched her tight and led her out through the gate. And Silas Crenshaw stood at the gatepost as she came through, and he tipped his hat to her, and he said the words he'd been saving. Quiet, the way a man tastes something sweet. A thief carries no brand on this range. She got up on the mare. She had $11 in her pocket, coins from her own small savings that they hadn't thought to take. She had the clothes on her back and a wool coat and a horse. She had nothing else in the world that anyone could see. But they hadn't taken the thing they couldn't touch. The head for figures. The eye for cattle. The knowing. That rode out the gate with her, and it was worth more than the $60, and worth more, in the end, than the whole Lazy V. She just didn't know it yet. She only knew she was leaving. She rode east along the creek. At the county line there was an old split-rail fence and a rise, and from the rise you could see the Lazy V one last time, small and gold under the low sun, smoke going up from the branding fires. She stopped Juniper there. She looked back at it. She let herself look for a long moment, at the land she'd loved before she could talk, at the corral rail with the mark burned into it, at the whole shape of the only life she'd known. Then, she faced east and rode on, and she did not look back again. Not that day. Not for 11 years. Cheyenne, when she came to it, was nothing like Coldwater Fork. It was a railhead town, loud and full of soot and strangers, where the Union Pacific came through day and night, and the streets never quite slept. She'd never seen so many people. She'd never felt so alone among people. The $11 went fast. A bed, a meal, a week of looking for anything. She learned quick what a girl alone with no name and no letter of character could get in a railroad town, and it wasn't much, and some of what was offered she turned her back on hard. What she found in the end was a washhouse behind a hotel, run by a hard woman who paid pennies and worked you till your hands cracked. Della took it. She stood over steaming tubs 12 hours a day and wrung sheets until her wrists ached and her knuckles bled into the water. It was a long way down from the corral rail and the ledger table. There were nights she lay on a cot in a boarding house attic and stared at the ceiling and felt the whole weight of what she'd lost sit on her chest. But she never cried where anyone could hear, and she never once wrote home to beg them to believe her. That door she'd nailed shut on the rise at the county line. Instead, she did a small thing that would turn out to be the whole of everything. She took a coffee tin, empty, with a tight lid, and every week she put a coin in it. A nickel. A dime, when she could. She hid it under a loose board beneath her cot, and she watched it fill the way she'd once watched a column of figures come out right, with a still, private satisfaction that no washhouse and no cracked knuckles could take from her. She was saving. She didn't know yet what for. She only knew that a woman with money in a tin answered to fewer people than a woman with none, and she was done answering to people who wouldn't hear her. She might have washed sheets for years if she hadn't met Etta Hollis. Etta ran a boarding house on a side street, a clean, plain place that took in drovers and drummers and railmen, and she ran it the way Della's father had run cattle, with an eye that missed nothing. She was a widow, gray and spare, with reading glasses she wore down her nose and a voice like a dry creek bed. She'd lost a husband to the war and a ranch to a bank and had built the boarding house up out of nothing but work and arithmetic, and she saw something in the washhouse girl who counted her change twice and never once counted it wrong. She offered Della a place. Cooking, cleaning, keeping the boarders in line, better pay, and a real bed. Della took it, and the coffee tin came with her. Heavier now. And one night, a few months in, Etta was at the kitchen table with her account book and her glasses down her nose, and she was frowning at it, muttering, running the same column twice. Della was drying dishes. She glanced over. She couldn't help it. She said, before she could stop herself, that 8 in the freight lines carried wrong. It's a 3. Etta looked up over her glasses. She looked at the girl a long moment. Then she looked at the column. And it was a 3. Well, Etta said, where'd a washhouse girl learn to read a ledger upside down across a table? I kept my father's books, Della said, since I was 14. Did you? Etta took her glasses off and folded them. And what happened to your father's books? Della was quiet. Then she said, I got run off for a thief I never was. And the books stayed. Etta Hollis had lived a long time and lost enough to know the true thing when she heard it said flat, without tears, by someone who'd stopped expecting to be believed. She didn't say she believed her. She did something better. She pushed the account book across the table, the same way a tired old man had once pushed a ledger across a table years before, and she said, Then sit down. If you're going to run a house someday, you'd best learn how the paper side of it really works. Not just the sums. The whole of it. And that was the turn. Though it didn't feel like one at the time, it felt like a woman being kind. But Etta Hollis knew things a wash house would never teach. She knew ledgers, contracts, notes, and interest. She knew how the freight trade ran, how a shipping bill was written and where a man could cheat you in one. She knew banks, and how they thought, and how a note came due, and what a lien was, and how land changed hands when the money ran dry. She'd learned it the hard way, losing that ranch to a bank that read the paper better than her husband could. And she'd promised herself she'd never be on the wrong side of a page again, and now she had someone to hand it to. Della drank it in like a dry field takes rain. This was her country, numbers and paper. But it was more than her father's simple ledger of cattle and feed. This was the machinery underneath the whole thing, the paper that moved land, the paper that had undone her. She saw that clear. The same kind of paper that ruined her, a forged letter in a false hand, could be read and mastered and turned. Whoever held the paper held the power. She meant to hold it. She saved. The coffee tin gave way to a real account at a Cheyenne bank, in her own name, Adeline Vance, written in her own true hand. When she had enough, she did the thing Etta had been steering her toward without quite saying so. She bought cattle. 50 head, cheap, from a drover caught short, who needed cash before the rails froze. She ran them on rented grass north of town with a boy she hired by the week. She'd been right about the price. They were sound stock, and she watched them the way she'd watched her father's herd, and for one season, it looked easy. Then came the winter of 1874, and it was not easy at all. It came down out of the north in January, and it did not let up. The kind of winter the old-timers still spoke of years after. The snow crusted over so the cattle couldn't paw down to the grass. The cold got into their lungs. Della and the hired boy rode out day after day into a white wind that took the feeling from your face, breaking crust, hauling hay she'd bought at a robber's price, dragging the downed cows up by main strength. She slept in her clothes. She forgot what warm felt like. When spring finally broke the country loose and she could count what was left, she had 12 head standing out of 50. The winter had killed 38. She stood in that muddy field in the thin spring sun and looked at the 12 gaunt survivors, and the numbers ran themselves in her head the way they always did. Most of her savings, most of 2 years of pennies in a tin and dollars off a boarding house wage, dead in the snow. There's a kind of person who quits there, who says the world means them to lose and lies down under it. Della was not that person, and the reason she wasn't traced straight back to a corral rail and a father who'd told her the mark was hers. She had known, once, what it was to belong to something. She had lost it to a lie. She was not going to lose the next thing to a hard winter, because a winter was only weather, and weather she understood. She didn't quit. She went back to Etta's kitchen and back to the wage, and she worked the loss off dollar by dollar, and she paid Etta back every cent of a small loan the old woman had made her for the hay, to the exact dollar, on the day she'd said she would. Etta counted it and looked at her over the glasses and said, "You didn't have to pay the last $2 this month. I'd have carried you." "I know," Della said. "That's why I paid it." Etta almost smiled. "You'll do," she said. And here is where the years did their quiet work, the work no single scene can hold, which is why it must be said plain. Between the girl who rode out of Coldwater Fork with $11 and the woman she was becoming there was a growing distance, and every dollar of it was earned, and every dollar had a cost. The cracked hands. The winter that killed 38 head. The nights over Etta's ledgers when other women her age were dancing. She was building something out of nothing but work and arithmetic and a refusal to be beaten, and it was making her into someone her own father wouldn't have known. She got into freight. That was Etta's world, and it became Della's. She learned the shipping trade from the paper up, and she was good at it. Better than good, because she never signed a contract she hadn't read 3 times and never let a dollar carry wrong. She bought her first parcel of land north of town, a scrubby lot with water on it, and she put a feed operation on it. Then a bigger one. She contracted to move feed and freight for the outfits shipping cattle east on the rails, and she was honest, and she was exact. And word got around that Vance's outfit didn't cheat and didn't miss, and in that country a name like that was worth more than capital. By 1881, the coffee tin was a memory, and Adeline Vance ran a feed and freight concern worth near $8,000. She did it quiet. She was not a woman who put her name on a sign bigger than it needed to be. In Cheyenne, she was respected, a shrewd trader, a woman who'd built herself up from a washhouse. But out west in Coldwater Fork, in the Sweetwater country where she'd been read off the courthouse steps, no one knew Adeline Vance was alive at all, let alone alive with means. They thought of her, if they thought of her, as the thief who'd run off with a gambler and come, no doubt, to a bad end. That was the story. Silas had written it, and the county had believed it, and 11 years had set it like a brand. She could have written a letter. She knew that. There were nights she thought about it, sitting up late with the lamp low, and her hand would half go to the pen. She could send word to Coldwater Fork that she'd made something of herself. She could make them know she was no thief. She wanted, some deep part of her still wanted, to be believed. But she'd learned a hard lesson on a loading chute at 19, watching 40 faces and not one open mouth. Words hadn't saved her then. Words were the thing that ruined her. A forged letter, a whispered rumor, an aunt's voice for the crowd. She'd stopped asking to be believed a long time ago. She'd decided instead to prove it. And there's a cost to that too, one she couldn't yet see. Because a woman who's learned to stop asking people to believe her can forget that people can still be reached at all. She'd forgotten it a little. She thought only the paper mattered now. The word came to her through the paper, in fact. Through the stock journal she read the way other people read scripture, cover to cover, every issue, every notice. It was a small item, the kind most people skip. It said that the Lazy V Ranch of Coldwater Fork, once among the soundest outfits in the Sweetwater country, had fallen on hard times under its present management, and that its owner of record was carrying debt. Present management. She read that twice. And then, further down, dry as bone, the line that stopped her hand on the page. Josiah Vance had died in the fall of 1878. 3 years gone. The old man had been dead 3 years, and she hadn't known it. She sat a long time with the journal open on the table. The lamp hissed. Outside, Cheyenne rattled and clanged the way it always did. And she understood 2 things at once, and they didn't fit together, and she had to hold them both. Her father was dead, and he had died believing the lie. He had gone into the ground believing his only child was a thief who'd robbed him and run off with a gambler. Whatever she built now, however high, he would never know. That door she'd nailed shut at the county line, she'd always half believed that someday she'd open it and walk back through and make him see. And now there was no one on the other side of it. He'd died with the last thing between them being that flat, unshaking voice on the loading chute. No daughter of mine. That was a grief she hadn't planned for. She sat with it a long while, and she did not cry, because she'd forgotten how in front of anyone and there was no one there, and even alone the tears wouldn't come. They'd gone somewhere years ago and turned into something else. The other thing she understood was colder and clearer. Present management. Silas Crenshaw had gotten the ranch. Of course he had. He'd framed her for it, and cast her out for it, and stood at the gate and tipped his hat, and then he'd worked his way in the rest of the way, married into it, or bought into it, or simply outlasted an old man's failing eyes, and now the Lazy V was his. The land she'd loved before she could talk, and he was running it into the ground. She could have written then. She could have gone to Coldwater Fork and stood in the road and shouted the truth. She did none of it. She'd learned the lesson too well. She didn't write, she didn't confront, she didn't warn. She put on her coat, and she walked down the Cheyenne Street to a set of stairs beside a saddle shop, and she climbed them to a door with a name painted on the frosted glass. Amos Teague, attorney at law. Teague was a careful man she'd used for her contracts, a man who read paper as well as she did and asked no questions he wasn't paid to ask. She'd trusted him with her freight deals for years. She was about to trust him with the whole of what she was. She sat down across the desk from him and she folded her hands, and when she spoke her voice was as steady as her father's had been on the loading chute, only there was no cruelty in it, only iron. "I want you to watch a ranch for me," she said. "The Lazy V, out at Coldwater Fork in the Sweetwater country. I want to know how it stands, what it owes, and who holds the paper. You'll do it quiet. My name stays out of it." Teague took up his pen. "And if I learn something?" "You'll learn it's failing," Della said. "You'll learn there's a note on it that a bad year will call due. And when that happens, when it goes to auction, and it will, you'll be there. You'll bid on it for me. In your own name, for a buyer you won't name. Whatever it takes." She paused. "Whatever it takes." Teague set his pen down. He looked at her over it, the way Etta looked over her glasses, weighing, "That could run to a great deal of money," he said. "More than you might. I'll know what it runs to before you do," Della said. "I keep my own books, Mr. Teague. You just be on those steps when the hammer comes down. And you don't say my name. Not to the county, not to the man who's running it into the ground. Not to anyone." They ran a thief off that land 11 years ago. Something moved in her face then, the first thing that had moved in it since she'd walked in the door. They can find out who she was on the day it's too late to do anything about it. Amos Teague was quiet a moment. Then he picked his pen back up, and he wrote it down, and he said, "Coldwater Fork. Undisclosed buyer." And the trap that would take 11 years to spring was set, and no one in the whole of the Sweetwater country had the least idea it was closing, least of all the man standing on land that had never been his, tipping his hat to a memory he thought he'd buried in the snow. The years after that did not hurry. Della had learned that money grows the way a herd grows, slow and against the weather, and she'd stopped expecting it to come any faster than it wanted to. Her first parcel was 40 acres of flat ground east of the Cheyenne yards. Nothing to look at. Sagebrush, and a dry wash, and a fence somebody else had let fall. She bought it in a spring when the railroad men were selling off cheap, and she paid cash, and she signed her own name to the deed. Adeline Vance. She wrote it slow. It was the first thing in 11 years that had her name on it and belonged to her both at once. She put up a feedlot on that flat ground. Then a scale house, then a long shed for the freight wagons when the teamsters came through hungry for grain and a place to lay over. She learned that a railhead town runs on two things. It runs on cattle going east, and it runs on everything those cattle need on the way. She sold the everything, hay and oats and shelled corn. Harness, axle grease, a bed for a driver, and a meal for his team. Etta Hollis watched her do it from the boarding house porch, and one evening she set down her mending and said, "You've got a gift for the middle of things, Della. Most people want to own the cattle. You worked out it's better to own the road they walk." "I owned cattle once," Della said. "It didn't keep." "This'll keep," Etta said. "This is on paper, and you know the paper now." She did know the paper now. That was the thing nobody had counted on. Back at Coldwater Fork, they'd run off a girl who kept books at 14 and could read a herd better than the men who branded it, and they'd thought the reading and the figuring would blow off her like dust the minute she left the gate. It didn't. It was the one thing they couldn't turn out of her saddlebag. She carried it the whole 30 miles and further, and in Cheyenne it grew teeth. By the summer of 1881, the concern was worth near $8,000. Feedlot, freight, the sheds, the scale, 2 teams of her own, and a standing contract with the stage line. $8,000, built out of 11 and a dun mare, one hard dollar laid on the next for 11 years. She kept it all in her own hand in a green ledger, and she balanced it every Sunday, and it always came out true, and it stayed quiet. That was the part she'd built on purpose. In Coldwater Fork, if they thought of Adeline Vance at all, they thought of a thief who'd frozen in a ditch someplace long ago. Nobody out there knew the name meant anything now. Nobody knew it meant money. She'd hung a plain sign over the feedlot gate that said Vance and CO, and let the county 300 miles west go on believing she was dead. Amos Teague sent his reports on the 1st of every month. Plain envelopes, a few lines each. She read them at the kitchen table with her coffee and told no one what they said. That autumn the reports changed. The Sweetwater country was drying up. It had been dry 2 summers running, and in 1881 the creeks went to gravel and the grass burned brown by July. Cattle died standing. The banks in Rawlins and Green River, who had lent freely against fat years, began to look hard at the paper they held. Teague's letter in September was longer than usual. The Lazy V, he wrote, was foundering. Silas Crenshaw had run it into a note of $4,200 with the Drovers and Stockman's Bank of Rawlins, borrowed against a herd that the drought was thinning by the week. The bank had called the note 90 days. If Crenshaw could not pay by the middle of January, the ranch would be sold at auction on the courthouse steps in Coldwater Fork to satisfy the debt. Della read it twice. Then she folded it and sat a long while with her hands flat on the table. 90 days. $4,200. The trap she'd set 11 years back, patient as a fence post, had a foot in it at last. She wrote Teague one line back. "Be ready. Bid as we agreed." The rest of that autumn she watched the thing tighten from 300 miles off, the way you'd watch a storm come up the flats, knowing there was nothing to do but be standing in the right spot when it broke. Silas scrambled. Teague's men in the country wrote that he rode to Rawlins twice, hat in hand, and to Green River once. He tried to raise backers. He offered a share of the ranch to a freight man named Oakes, who looked at the books and declined. He tried the neighbors he'd spent 11 years lording over, and they had nothing to lend and no love to lend it with. The drought had them all by the throat, and all the while the county chewed over the one juicy bone in the whole affair. There was a buyer coming. Word had leaked, the way it does, that a Cheyenne lawyer named Teague had been asking after the Lazy V for a year and more, quiet, on behalf of a party he would not name. An undisclosed buyer. In a dying country that was the only living thing to talk about, and they talked it to rags. Some said it was the railroad, looking to run a spur up the Sweetwater. Some said it was Harlan Pruitt, the big cattleman east of the Fork, buying his neighbors as they failed. Some said a syndicate out of Omaha, or Denver, or Chicago. In Wingate's store and at the county wells they laid bets on it. A railroad man. A cattle king. A pack of Eastern money with no face. Not one soul in the whole of the Sweetwater country said the name of the girl they'd run off. Why would they? She was 11 years dead and gone. The joke of it was, they were arguing over a ghost, and the ghost was reading their arguments by lamplight 300 miles away and saying nothing at all. The auction was posted the first week of January. Teague sent word, and a neighbor sent word, and it went up on the courthouse door in Coldwater Fork on a sheet of paper for the whole county to read. Sale of the Lazy V Ranch, Coldwater Fork, to satisfy a note held by the Drovers and Stockman's Bank. Cash to the highest bidder on the courthouse steps, the 17th of January, 1882, Della read her copy at the kitchen table. Then she went upstairs and took down her traveling case. There was one thing she packed that she'd told no one about. Weeks before, she'd gone to a smith on the Cheyenne Yards, an old German who did fine work, and she'd sat with him an afternoon and drawn out a shape from memory. A Lazy V. The letter tipped on its side, the way her father had cut it 40 years back for the corral rail. She had him forge it in good iron, the head and the long haft, and she'd taken it home wrapped in oilcloth and not shown it to Etta or to anyone. She didn't fully know why she'd had it made. Only that when she thought of walking back onto that ground, she couldn't do it empty-handed. She'd been forbidden to touch the iron on her way out. She meant to carry one back in. She wrapped it again in the oilcloth and laid it in the bottom of the case, under her good dark dress and a veil. Etta came to the station to see her off. The old woman held both her hands on the platform in the cold. "You've been 11 years getting to this train," Etta said. "You sure you know what you're riding toward?" "I know exactly," Della said. "Cold's not the same as sure, girl." Della looked at her. The steam blew between them. "It'll do," she said. "It's what I've got, and it'll do." Etta let go of her hands. "Then go get your ground," she said. And Della, "Come back and tell me every word of it." The eastbound took her to the junction, and the northbound stage carried her up into the Sweetwater country over 2 hard days. And on the morning of the 17th of January, she came into Coldwater Fork for the first time in 11 years. It had grown a little and failed a little, both at once. There was a bank now, and a second street. But the drought sat on it like a gray hand, and half the storefronts were shut, and the people on the walk moved slow and looked at the ground. She kept her veil down. Nobody knew her. She walked past the mercantile where Wingate still stood behind his counter, past the well where her aunt had once said what she said, and nobody so much as turned a head. She was a woman in dark clothes off the morning stage, and the town had bigger trouble than her. The courthouse was a square stone building at the head of the street, and by 10 o'clock the steps were crowded. Half the county had come in for it. A foreclosure is a kind of funeral, and people come to funerals. Della stood at the back, at the edge of the crowd, her veil down and her gloved hands folded, and she watched them gather. She knew the faces. Older. Most of them. Weathered down. But she knew them. There were men on those steps who had stood at the autumn branding 11 years back and watched her father read her out and said not one word for her. 40 of them, near enough, had watched it then. A good share of the same 40 stood here now, come to watch another Vance thing end. She found Verna in the crowd and had to hold herself still. Her aunt had aged. She stood near the front in a good gray bonnet, the best thing on the whole street, her chin up, playing the county lady among the ruined. Verna Toole, who had said we always knew what she was to 40 neighbors and gone home to her supper. She stood there now, not 10 feet from a niece she thought was bones in a ditch, and she never felt the cold come off her. And there, at the top of the steps, near the bankman and the crier, stood Silas Crenshaw. 11 years had thickened him and grayed him and hardened the set of his jaw. But it was him. The man who had lifted a strongbox coin and dropped it in her saddlebag and forged her hand on fine cream paper and stood at the gate and said a thief carries no brand on this range. He stood on the courthouse steps in a good coat he couldn't pay for, on land that had never been his. And he wore the face of a man about to lose it, and knowing there was one last thin chance the note might be bought by a stranger who'd keep him on to run it. Amos Teague was there too, off to the side, gray and neat, a leather case under his arm. He did not look at the woman in the veil at the back of the crowd. That had been the agreement. He didn't so much as glance her way. The crier came out at 11 and read the notice in a flat voice, and then the bankman said his piece about the debt, and then it began. "The property is offered as it stands," the crier called. "Cash on the barrel to the highest bid." "Who will open?" "4,200, said the bankman. The bank enters the note as the floor. For a moment nobody moved, and Della's heart went sideways, because for one moment it looked like the bank would simply take it back and there'd be no sale at all. Then Amos Teague said, 4,300, in a dry lawyer's voice, and the crowd stirred, because there he was, the ghost's man, the undisclosed buyer come to bid at last. And then a big voice from the middle of the steps said, 4,500, and heads turned, because that was Harlan Pruitt. Della knew him by reputation from Teague's letters. A cattle baron off the East Range, broad and florid in a buffalo coat, a man who bought failing neighbors for sport and pasture both. He'd come to swallow the Lazy V cheap the way he'd swallowed 3 other outfits that dry year, and he did not mean to be beaten by a Cheyenne lawyer with no name behind him. 46, said Teague. 5,000, said Pruitt flat, to end it. A murmur ran the crowd. 5,000 was a great deal for dry ground in a dead year. Silas, at the top, went pale, because at 5,000 there was no version of the day where he came out of it holding anything. 5,100, Teague said. 55, said Pruitt, and turned half around to look at the lawyer, letting the crowd see him look, the way a big man looks at a small one to make him quit. Teague did not quit. 57. 6,000, Pruitt said, and there was heat in it now, because he had not expected a fight and did not like the taste of one. Della stood at the back and did the figuring the way she'd done figuring her whole life, cold, in her head, faster than the crier could call. 6,000. She had near 8,000 in the world, and most of it was ground and sheds and wagons she'd have to sell to raise cash, and some of it was cash in hand she'd brought precisely for this. She had told Teague a number. Whatever it takes, she'd said, 11 years ago, and she'd meant it, but she'd also set a reserve, because a woman who'd built 8,000 out of $11 did not throw the whole of it off a cliff for spite. The reserve was 7,500. 6,200, Teague said. 65, said Pruitt. 6,008, said Teague. The crowd was dead silent now. This was more money than had changed hands in Coldwater Fork in a decade, and it was being flung back and forth over the head of a ranch that couldn't grow grass. And everyone on those steps understood that the two bidders were no longer buying dirt. They were buying the win. The lawyer's silent master and the cattle king had gotten their backs up, and neither would be the one to fold. Silas watched it with the sick look of a man whose fate was being decided by two strangers who'd forgotten he existed. 7,000, Pruitt said, and put his hands in his coat, done, sure of it. 7,000. No lawyer for a faceless buyer goes past 7,000 on dry ground. He was certain of it. Amos Teague looked, for the first time, toward the back of the crowd. It was a small thing. A turn of the head, a half-second, a lawyer glancing at nobody in particular. But Della saw it come to her, the question in it, and she understood that this was the edge of everything. This was the whole 11 years come down to a nod, or no nod. 7,000 was under her reserve by $500. One more bid, and she'd be inside her line by a hair. If Pruitt went again, she'd be over, and over meant selling every board she owned and maybe not covering it, and a smart woman lets the ground go before she lets her whole life go for a fight. She thought about her father reading her name off these steps. She gave the smallest nod in the world. 7,450, Amos Teague said. It landed on the crowd like a dropped plate. 450. Not 500, not a round leap, a strange particular figure. The figure of somebody who had run the numbers to the last dollar of what they'd spend, and would spend not 1 cent past it. Pruitt heard the particularity of it, and understood it the way Della had meant it to be understood. It said, "This is my last coin, and I have counted it, and you cannot outlast me, because I have nothing left to lose, and I know exactly where my nothing sits." Harlan Pruitt stood there in his buffalo coat, and he did the sum in his own head, and he took his hands out of his coat. "It's dry ground," he said to the crowd, to himself, half a laugh in it. "Let the mystery man have his dust." And he stepped back. The crier looked around. 7,450. Any advance on 7,450? He waited. Silas made a sound, a strangled start of a word, a man with no money making the shape of a bid he could not pay, and the crier passed over him. Going once. Going twice. The hammer came down, sold to Mr. Teague for the party he represents. $7,450, cash, and the whole county turned to see who'd bought the Vance Ranch, and there was nobody to see. Only a gray lawyer with a leather case, bowing slightly, saying, "My client will come forward to sign." Silas Crenshaw let out a breath you could hear 10 feet off. Della watched it go out of him. Relief. Pure animal relief. Whoever the buyer was, it was no known enemy, no man he'd wronged, no ghost from his past. It was money with no face, and money with no face keeps a foreman on to run the place. Because money with no face doesn't know cattle from carriage horses, and needs a man who does. He was already fixing his coat. He was already getting ready to be useful to his new master. She watched him decide, in the space of that breath, that he'd survived it. Amos Teague turned toward the back of the crowd and lifted one hand, an usher's small gesture, and said, "If my client will come forward and sign the county's book." The woman in the dark dress and the veil came up through the crowd. They parted for her without knowing why. A veiled woman, off the morning stage, walking slow up the courthouse steps toward the crier's open ledger and the deed in the lawyer's hand. The county went quiet to watch her, the mystery made flesh at last, and every neck craned, and Verna Tull in her good gray bonnet turned with the rest to see the great buyer, the railroad man, the syndicate. The face behind the faceless money. Della stopped at the top of the steps. She set her gloved hand on the ledger. She looked out once at the 40 faces she had carried in her mind for 11 years. The same 40, older, turned up to her now, the way they'd been turned up to her father then. And she lifted the veil. For a moment it meant nothing to them. A woman's face. A stranger. Then it began to move through the crowd, the way water moves through cracked ground. One face, and then the next, an old hand who'd worked the branding, a woman who'd stood at the well, recognition breaking over them one at a time, and each one going white with it. Verna Tull made a small sound and put her hand to the front of her good bonnet. Silas Crenshaw's face did not go white. It went gray, and then it went slack, the face of a man watching the dead sit up. Della let them all get there. She had waited 11 years. She could wait the 10 seconds it took the whole courthouse steps to understand that Adeline Vance was standing on them with a deed in her hand. Then she looked at Silas, and she spoke, and her voice was quiet and it carried to the last man in the crowd, because they had all gone that still. "You read me off these steps 11 years back," she said. "I bought them. Step down." Nobody breathed. Silas Crenshaw found his tongue. "You." He stopped. Started again. You can't just—" "The deed says I can," Della said. She took it from Teague's hand and held it up, not high, just enough, the way a man holds up a letter he's forged, and she let the county see it. Amos Teague, of Cheyenne, bidding for an undisclosed buyer. The buyer's Adeline Vance. She let that sit. The daughter you ran off this ground for a thief. I've been the undisclosed buyer the whole time, Silas. You spent 3 months looking for money to save your neck, and it was mine you were bidding against. She turned and pressed her thumb to the wax seal the crier held out and signed her name under it in the county book. Adeline Vance. Slow, the way she signed everything. The crier watched her do it and had no idea he'd just recorded the end of a lie 11 years old. At the front of the crowd, Harlan Pruitt, who had already lost and did not much care, took off his hat to her and said, loud enough to be heard, "Ma'am, I've paid to learn a lesson today, and it was worth the schooling. Good day to you." And he settled his hat and walked off down the steps, and there was a thread of something like respect in the way he went. But Della was not done, and the county could feel it. "You've heard I bought this ranch," she said, turning back to them. "Now you're going to hear why it was never right that I lost it. Every one of you that stood at the Lazy V branding in the autumn of 1871, you stood and watched a girl read out for a thief. I've spent 11 years and near everything I own to stand here and answer that in front of the same eyes that watched it happen. So you'll stand a while longer." She looked out over them, and she found the man she wanted at the edge of the crowd, an old wrangler, bent now, his hat already in his 2 hands. "Ezra Bell," she said. "Come up here." The old man came. He'd been 63 when it happened, and he was near old as the hills now, and he climbed the steps slow, and he would not look at Silas, and he would not, at first, look at her. "Ezra," Della said, gentler than she'd said anything all day. "You wouldn't meet my eyes the morning it happened. By the strongbox shed. You remember." "I remember," Ezra said. His voice cracked on it. "Tell them what you saw. You've carried it 11 years. Set it down." The old man turned his hat in his hands. He looked at the crowd, and then, at last, he looked at Silas Crenshaw, and something in the looking straightened his back a little. "I saw Silas take the gold," Ezra said. The words came out rough, and then they came out clear. $60, out the strongbox, in the shed, the morning before the branding. I was in the dark of the shed mending a hackamore, and he didn't see me. I saw him count it into a pouch, and that evening I saw him go to Miss Della's dun, where it stood saddled in the yard, and I saw him put that pouch in her offside saddlebag with his own hand. He swallowed. Then he found me, and he told me if I ever said a word he'd swear I was in it with her, and I'd hang or worse. I was an old man with no place else to go. So I kept still. I kept still 11 years, and I watched Josiah die believing it, and it's rotted in me every day of them. God forgive me. I should have spoke at the gate. The crowd made a low sound, 40 people breathing out at once. "He's an old fool and a liar," Silas said, loud, too loud. "He's got nothing. It's her word in a senile hands. That's all it's not all it is," Della said. She looked to the crowd again. "Is Mr. Wingate here? From the Mercantile?" He was. He came up, a soft, nervous man in an apron, holding a big ledger he'd been asked that morning to bring, and hadn't understood why. "Mr. Wingate keeps a daybook," Della said, "same as any storekeep. Every purchase, dated, named, Mr. Wingate, would you find the week of the autumn branding, 1871, and read the county what Silas Crenshaw bought from you that week." Wingate set the big book on the ledger stand and turned the stiff old pages, back and back, mouthing the dates. The crowd waited. It took him a while. Then he stopped and put his finger on a line and read it out in his soft voice. 2nd of October, 1871, Wingate read. 2 sheets, fine paper, S. Crenshaw, 11 cents. He looked up, blinking, fine cream letter paper. "I remember it, matter of fact, on account of nobody out here ever bought the fine kind. He said it was for a letter that had to look right." "A letter that had to look right," Della repeated. She let it hang there in the cold. Every soul on those steps had seen or heard tell of the forged letter that Silas held up 11 years back, the letter in a hand like hers, planning to run off with the gambler and money to match. The letter that had turned witnessed suspicion into public certainty. And here was the storekeep's own book, unremarked for 11 years, dated the very week, naming the very man, buying the very fine paper no honest hand in the county had reason to own. He bought the paper to write the letter in my hand, Della said, the week before he needed it. It's been sitting in Mr. Wingate's book the whole 11 years, waiting. 2 sheets. 11 cents. That's what my name was worth to him. Silas Crenshaw looked at the ledger, and he looked at Ezra Bell, and he looked at 40 faces that had gone from doubt to certainty while he stood there, and the fight went out of his legs. The sheriff had been in the crowd the whole time, a heavy, quiet man named Deal, and now he came up the steps unhurried and put his hand on Silas Crenshaw's arm. "She can't prove I wrote a thing," Silas said, "but it came out thin. It's an old book and an old man. It's a dated ledger and a sworn witness," Silas, Sheriff Deal said, "and it's forgery and false witness and theft of $60, and it's 11 years old, but there's no law says a lie's safe, just for keeping. You'll come with me." Silas Crenshaw turned once at the top of the steps he had run her off 11 years back, and he looked at Della with something working in his face, and he opened his mouth. Della got there first. She said it quiet, the way she'd said all of it, and she gave it back to him whole. "A thief carries no brand on this range, Silas." She held his eyes. "You said it." The sheriff walked him down. He went down the courthouse steps with a hand on his arm and 40 people watching. And he did not look back at the ranch, and that was the last the county saw of him a free man. Della came down after, into the crowd, and it opened for her again, but different now. Hats were coming off. Old men who'd stood silent at a branding 11 years back stood silent now in a different way, the silence of men who knew they'd watched a wrong done and said nothing, and knew there was no word big enough to unsay it, and took their hats off instead. It wasn't much. But it was the whole Cattlemen's Association of the Sweetwater country standing bareheaded in the cold to a woman they'd shunned, and everybody there understood the account was closed. Verna Tull had not moved from the front rank. She stood in her good gray bonnet with no ground under her anymore, because the household she'd ruled belonged now to the niece she'd damned. And she knew it. Della stopped in front of her. The whole crowd was watching. Verna's chin was still up, but her eyes had gone frightened, and she was reaching after something to say and finding nothing. Della did not shout at her. She had promised herself, riding the 2 days up from the junction, that she would not lose her calm no matter what stood in front of her. And she didn't. "Verna," she said. One word, and it made the old woman flinch. "You said you always knew what I was." She looked at her aunt a moment longer. "You'll want your things off my porch by Sunday." And that was all. That was the whole reckoning she gave her. She turned and left her standing there in her good bonnet on ground that was no longer hers, and it was worse than any shouting could have been, and Verna Tull knew it, and so did everyone who watched. There was one reckoning left, and it was not on the courthouse steps, and no one came to watch it. 2 days later, when the papers were signed and the sheriff had done his work, and the county had gone home to talk of nothing else for a year, Della rode out alone to the Lazy V for the first time in 11 years. She rode up the rise behind the home place where the family was buried, and she got down, and she stood at her father's grave. Josiah Vance. The stone said the years. 1874 he'd cut it wrong, no, it said the true years. Born and died, 1878 at the end of it. He died 3 years back believing every word of the lie. That was the one thing in all of it she could not buy back, and she had known it since the day she read it in the stock journal, and it was the only part that had ever made her want to cry, and she hadn't, not then. She did a little now, alone on the rise, where nobody could count it against her. "It wasn't me, Pa," she said. "The wind took it." I know you can't hear it now. I know you went into the ground sure I stole from you, and there's no fixing that, and I've made my peace that there's no fixing it. But it wasn't me. It was Silas, the whole of it, from the coin to the letter, and Ezra saw it. And it's proved now, in front of the same people that heard you read me out. Your name's clean, and mine is too. I got the ranch back. I've got it in my own hand now, the way you always said it'd be someday. She put her hand flat on the cold top of the stone. This mark's yours, you told me. Someday, well, someday came, Pa. I'm sorry you missed it. I'm sorry you missed all of it. She stood with her hand on the stone a long while in the wind, and then she wiped her face once with the back of her glove, and she went back down the rise to the ranch that was hers. Spring came late to the Sweetwater country that next year, and it came wet, which the country needed, and the grass came up green over ground that had been gray a year before. On a morning in the spring of 1883, the sun came up over the lazy V, the color of clover honey, and Adeline Vance stood at the corral rail with a cup of coffee steaming in the cold air and watched the first calves of the year in the north pasture. The place had come back. It took near everything she had left after the auction, and a hard first year, and she'd sold the Cheyenne feedlot to do it. But the lazy V was stock again and green again and hers. There were 50 head in the north pasture and more coming, and a good bull and mended fence, and the home place had a new roof and smoke coming out of the chimney. Ezra Bell had his place back. She'd ridden out to the line shack where he'd been scratching a living and told him there was a bunk and a wage and a job as long as he wanted it. And the old man had wept. And now he ran the corral and was gentle with the young horses and slept easy for the first time in 11 years. That was worth as much to her as the ranch. Near about. A man who'd found the nerve at the end deserved to lay it down and rest. That morning there was a fire going in the corral, and the lazy V iron laid in the coals. Her own iron, the twin she'd had cut from memory by the old German smith in Cheyenne, carried up here wrapped in oilcloth. It had a right to be here now. It had come back the way she'd come back. Ezra brought up the first spring calf, and she set her coffee on the rail, and she took the iron out of the coals, the head glowing dull red, the long haft warm through her glove. She'd watched her father do this when she was a girl. This mark's yours someday, Della girl. She pressed it to the calf's hip, quick and clean the way he'd taught her, and the calf bawled and kicked free, and there it was, the lazy V, tipped on its side, burned into the hide of the first calf born on her own ground in her own year. She stood back and looked at it, and she let herself feel the whole of it once, and then she picked her coffee back up. There was a wagon on the road that morning. Etta Hollis, come up from Cheyenne on the stage and the last miles by hire, an old woman in a good coat with a carpetbag, come to see with her own eyes the ground her girl had won back. Della went out to meet her and brought her in, and Etta stood in the ranch office and ran her finger down the green ledger on the desk, the one Della still balanced every Sunday, and she said, "Clean as I taught you," and there was pride in it thick enough to cut. "You taught me the paper," Della said. "The paper's what got it back." "The paper and 11 years and a spine like a fence post," Etta said. "Don't go crediting the paper for what was you." They took their coffee out to the porch in the honey light, 2 women in chairs, the calves calling in the north pasture and the smell of green coming up off the ground. Down along the east line a neighbor was working, a decent, quiet man rebuilding the fence between his place and hers, hammering staples in the still morning, and now and again he'd straighten and lift a hand her way, and she'd lift one back, and nothing was said about it, and nothing needed to be. There'd be time enough for whatever that was. There was time enough for everything now. "You know what I keep thinking," Della said, watching the country come green. "All those years they thought they'd taken something off me. The ranch. My name. My father even. And they never took the one thing that was ever really mine, which was what I knew how to do. You can't run a person off from that. It rides out the gate with them." She sipped her coffee. A thing that's taken by a lie was never really kept. It just sits there in the wrong hands, waiting. This ground was always going to come back to me. It only took me 11 years to be able to carry it. Etta didn't answer. She didn't need to. They sat in the honeylight and let the morning go by, and the calf with the fresh brand found its mother in the north pasture, and the sun came up gold over the lazy V, and it was, at last, a quiet place to be. If you rode any of that trail with her, comment the town you're watching from. I'd like to know how far this one carried.